Hello, I'm Kelvin Leibold. I'm the ISU Extension North Central Area Farm Management Field Specialist based up in Iowa Falls. And today I wanted to share a little bit about what's going on in the carbon markets and a little bit on the pipelines that are being proposed. And so we'll start off here looking at what some of the challenges that I think we face as we go ahead here. I've had the opportunity to do a little traveling internationally, and now when I think about what's going on globally, I just see that there's fewer ag pesticides out there. We're going to see more and more consumer pressure on how we produce products. That's both crops and livestock. And we're going to need to reduce our carbon footprint. And there's going to be a lot of emphasis on being greener, as in greenhouse gas emissions and what we can do there. But at the same time, we need to remain profitable, because if we can't do it profitably, we're not going to be very sustainable in any of these things. So when I look at these are certainly some major challenges as we face going forward, but these are also opportunities for people who can do these things and do them well. So when I take a look at what's going on in the rest of the world, I take a look at what's going on in the European Union. They tend to be out in front of us a little bit on some of the environmental issues. And so the European Union wants to become net zero on greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And so there's a lot of concern about loss of biodiversity, honeybees, whatever you name. In Germany, we saw a referendum where they placed restrictions on what chemicals could be used. So anyhow, if you take a look at the item 5 there, it talks about nutrient pollution of ground and surface water is still a serious issue, despite many years of political measures to try to fix the problem. Well, that sounds like Iowa. We've dealt with groundwater issues and surface water issues for the past several years as well. If you take a look at what they plan to do to try to address some of those issues, land management is a big part of it. Of course, they still have peat bogs that they use and harvest peat from. But if we take a look here in the United States, in Iowa, just this morning I was dealing with a drainage issue. We spent $40,000 up in Winnebago County working with a client on a drainage project. Okay, so and of course fertilizer is one that always gets mentioned, and whether it's the livestock with the dairy cows and the other ruminants, and nitrogen fertilizer is important as we look forward. So it doesn't matter where in the world we go, there's still a lot of focus on how we manage things. So Europe has had a big focus on pushing to organics. Okay, so part of their food to fork program is they're 25% organic by the year 2030. Heck, I think I'll even live to see 2030. Well, so right now, if you take a look at how they're trying to push that agenda, it's with $300 an acre in government subsidies. Okay, so I mean, $300 an acre, that's more than what we saw last year with all the government tariff subsidies and whatnot. So are they going to make that goal? I don't know, but again, there's a lot of challenges in going and pushing to a different system, okay? And my friend Yeltos talks about that in the European Union, there's no uniform ag system. There's a big difference between the different countries. And certainly in the United States, if you're talking about almonds in California or apples in Washington or onions in Texas, the agriculture is not the same. The one thing that we look at on these different proposed changes is, will they be counterproductive? If I take and limit the use of nitrogen fertilizer by 10% and I drive yields down, am I really going to make fewer greenhouse gas emissions? Is my mitigation strategy really going to work? So, you know, I look at these European strategies and I say, well, that's pretty darn positive for Iowa corn growers. We're going to be more competitive in the long run if we don't have to deal with the same issues. But the fact is, eventually we're going to have to deal with the same issues. Okay, so what does the U.S. government look like today? We had Executive Order 1408 that was signed by President Biden in January 27th, almost a year ago. Okay, the goal is what? To conserve at least 30% of the nation's water and 30% of the lands by 2030. Well, what does that mean? I'm not sure what that order really means. So I looked to see what's the USDA say, because we all think that the USDA is going to play a big role in this. And here you've got this nice web page. Well, it looks like a wind farm web page, but they slapped a little icon on there that says carbon. So that must be the carbon web page. Well, is this anything new? Well, I took a look here at, in 2013 was the most thorough report that I could find. It was 270 pages in length, and it talked about climate change and what we could do in agriculture. And if you could read the words on the left columns, you can see there's really nothing new in those lists, whether it's based on tillage, whether it's based on fertilizer or land use. Or taking land out of production. These aren't new ideas, okay? So in 2016, they had a new report. They got that down to 74 pages. So maybe that was their idea of saving carbon, was by using fewer trees to print the report on. Well, what's the most recent one? Well, the most recent document that I could find was in 2021. It's only 40 pages long, so they managed to save some more paper. And it highlights some of the strategies focusing on research, and partnerships is a new word that they're talking about, because government isn't going to be able to do this on their own. This is going to require a lot of other players. And when I look at the other players out there, one of the things that it refers to is to build resilience across landscapes with investments in soil and forest health. I don't know what that means. You can read down through all of those. I'm not really sure what it means. I get to the last one, and it says, leverage the USDA climate hubs as a framework to support the USDA mission areas in delivering adaptive science, technology, and tools. Well, what kind of adaptation are we talking about? Well, I actually know something about that one. We used to have what was called the Soil Tilth Lab. It's the building next to the one that I'm recording this seminar in. And so the Midwest Climate Hub is formerly known as the Soil Tilth Lab. Dennis Doty is the director. And they've been doing research on different tillage systems, different soil treatment systems, how weather, different temperatures affects corn plants, affects soybean plants and their growth. So there's a lot of great research that's been done there, and more that needs to be done. I think that's one of the things that we're finding out is that we really don't have the answers. Every time we seem to, so to speak, turn over a rock, we find more questions underneath that rock. So these Midwest Climate Hub here in Ames hopefully will be helpful to us as we move forward. So I'm supposed to talk a little about carbon, so let's talk about money. If we think about what a carbon offset is worth in Europe on their futures board, it's worth about 80 euros, which would come back to about 13% above that. It's about a $90 value. And so, again, big numbers. Well, we've got a lot of players out there that are offering to buy carbon credit offsets, but for much lower dollar amounts. And maybe we can address that a little bit here as we go through the program today. So again, that's pretty significant payment rate. And you can see that it's increased significantly over time. And if you think about the California market, we have a cap and trade system there. And those values are significantly less, like a fourth of what the European market is. They've increased significantly here over the last 2 years, but why are they not trading at the same level that the European carbon credits are? After all, carbon circulates the globe in the upper atmosphere, right? Well, the reason for that probably is that credit quality matters. Not all carbon exchanges are the same level of quality. So when you think about agriculture and sequestering carbon in the soils, that's a relatively cheap way to generate some significant quantities of what I would consider to be low quality credits. And we can do that relatively fast. You think about high quality ag credits, and then we start talking about things like additionality and permanency, and we'll talk about that more. that gets us a better quality credit. The buyer of those credits puts more faith in that unit that we're actually going to sequester carbon for the next few hundred years at least. That's why forestry and industrial capture of CO2 from the atmosphere can get us large quantities of carbon, and they're considered a lot higher quality. You know, if we go back and look at how did we get coal in the first place, you know, that was from being sequestered largely through forests, okay? So, you know, again, this makes a difference in what the value of it is and what the industry is willing to pay. So if you start going and thinking about who's been issuing these credits, these are kind of like certificates, and you can see in the top line up there that forestry is by far the dominant player in this marketplace. Then we look at the second is what? Wind energy and solar energy. So they're big players as well. And then you get down there about fifth from the bottom and you run into agriculture. Not really a very big player at this time. But the question is can it be a big player? Should it be a big player? And how will we be able to justify and verify that we're a really high quality credit? Okay. So a carbon credit is an asset. Think about a certificate or a permit. If you think about the ethanol plants, they all have permits to discharge CO2 into the atmosphere. Okay, so this is something that represents the right to release or emit carbon into the atmosphere like an ethanol plant would. All right, so typically each credit represents 1 metric ton, and a metric ton's a little about 10% bigger than a US ton. And we talk about carbon dioxide as being the standard, and then the other gases are the equivalent amounts. So nitrous oxide is a high counting gas compared to carbon dioxide. So carbon credits are created when an entity reduces their carbon emissions or takes carbon out of the atmosphere. Okay, and so we have a baseline. So when we think about raising corn, we're a lot more efficient today in nitrogen use. With higher yields, we're a lot more efficient in the land use. And so if we go back and pick a 1960 baseline when you had 125 bushel yield, you can see that we would actually pick up some credits just because of the baseline. So again, when we look at these programs, we always need to go back and think about, well, what's my baseline here that we're benchmarking against? So how can ag create these credits that we can trade? Okay, well, going from conventional tillage to no-till perhaps would increase the organic matter in the soil. Okay, we can talk about that though. So are we increasing the organic matter in the top 6 inches or in the top 40 inches? Okay, so European standards would basically measure a meter deep, 40 inches, and look at the carbon profile in the top meter of soil. Okay. Reducing stocking rates on pasture. Well, that's probably going to get us less of those animals out there belching methane. Planting cover crops. So the key with cover crops is to get root growth. When we get root growth, we're going to get carbon sequestration in the soils. Of course, planting trees, reducing fertilizer rates. You know, when you think about fertilizer, you've got all the energy that goes into manufacturing the fertilizer itself, transporting the fertilizer. So we can go back through the different chains, the value chains, and look at where we can have savings all throughout that chain. Okay? And then converting marginal cropland to grassland would be beneficial as well. Okay? So when you start looking at this, there's a couple of things that I go back and think about. You know, I've got some CRP. If I want to take an existing waterway and put it into a CRP and make it into a better waterway, can I do that? Well, no. My old waterway doesn't have a corn base. Okay, it can't meet this new idea of additionality. So what are you going to do that you weren't doing before? Okay, how does the new practices change from your current practices? So those people that were doing the best job with soil stewardship are going to get penalized under this program because they're not going to be able to do anything additional. If I was doing no-till with cover crops and reduced fertilizer levels, okay, what am I going to do to be able to build upon that? What additional things am I going to do that I'm going to be able to get credit for? Okay, so that's this current issue of what's my current practices and what am I doing above and beyond that. So there's a variety of different programs out there. Some of them might allow you to look back and go back 2 to 5 years and say, okay, so this is what we were doing before this current time period, so we should get some credit for the changes we've made in the last few years. So again, we'll talk about those contracts here in a minute. The other thing is that permanency matters, okay? So how long are you going to sequester this? Are you going to sequester this for 5 years and then go back to a moldboard plow? Well, I don't think so. But how do we know that this is really going to be a permanent solution and this carbon that we get back into the soil is going to stay there? I mean, we've taken probably roughly half of the carbon out of many of the soils up here in the Corn Belt. So if we put those carbon credits back in the soil, are they going to stay there? And if you start looking at these agreements, what happens if we stop midway through? We might have a 10-year payment that has a 20-year look-back window. Okay, if you default on the contract, who's got to pay for the default? Okay, those are some things to think about. All right, and then who's going to verify this stuff? Okay, when we take a look at farms that are certified organic, we realized pretty quickly that we needed some type of a system that was going to, do the verification. So we have to measure how much is being sequestered. We have to report on that. We have to verify that. Okay, so who's going to be the agency that's going to do that? The better that measuring, reporting, and verification system is, the higher quality of credit you're going to have, I think, in the end, and the more value it will have in the end. Okay, so we talk about the carbon market being the Wild West, that we're out there with different contracts that are being offered and different approaches, and nobody's got the same strategy, and we're not all going down the same road, and that's okay. Okay, we need to take a look at how these different issues are going to be addressed. How does the money flow through the system? How does the data flow through the system? I don't hear much discussion about that issue either. Okay, so agriculture needs to be involved in these discussions, otherwise we'll be left by the wayside, or we may be regulated like the Europeans are without the compensation, which would be probably, as far as sustainability, the worst of both worlds along that. So again, stay involved in these discussions, realize that it's a changing set of rules, and we'll see what happens as we move forward. We get looking at who are the players in this, and it's really a wide range of players out there. One I see up there is General Mills. I happen to own a few shares of stock in that I acquired, and we're thinking about traceback, and we're thinking about looking back to how the whole food supply chain comes together. I'm old enough to remember the days when we used to go and take the grain truck to the elevator, and we picked up Furadan and Bladex and Atrazine, and then we threw that in the back of the grain truck, and all summer long we slopped that stuff around. The Furadan was the rootworm killer, that shiny little stuff that was kind of hard on sparrows, if I remember right. But anyhow, that would have been off-label, I guess. But nonetheless, when we think about that, we slopped that stuff all around the bottom of the grain truck, and then in the fall, we got rid of all those boxes and bags and cans and hoses, and we put the tailgate back in and started hauling grain, and by the end of the season, the bottom of that box was shined up real nice. Well, where'd all those residues go? So it's not just about how carbon gets sequestered that we're going to face here as we go forward. We're going to face a total look back at how the whole system handles accountability and trace back, and what are the functions and the features that are in these different systems, and how these attributes get handled. I mean, historically, corn was a bulk commodity, but a lot of these players that you see here on the screen, it doesn't matter whether it's animals or grains, they're going to look for trace back and accountability all throughout the system. Okay, so we need to be prepared for that. well, let's take a look at how some of these projects develop. Alejandro Plastina and his team went in and tried to kind of identify some of these contracts, and they looked at four basic things. Okay, what's the methodology? Okay, what's the data and the information that gets passed around? And then how's the money flow? And of course, then the carbon credits, how do they get originated and how do they get handled and distributed and finally end up in somebody's hands that wants them, okay? So again, if you take a look at the carbon credits is the dotted line there, you can see that you've got the ERPAs, so these are the people that purchase these credits, and you've got a project developer, okay? So typically you've got some type of a project developer. They set up the guidelines, the standards, and kind of pull everything together. So you see that then there's a registry of some type in the upper left hand there. They're the one that's going to actually issue the certificate based on their standards. So the project developer sends them what? A little bit of money, and they get a certificate. Then the project developer can sell that certificate to the end user and they get money. And then down at the bottom there, you see that the farmers are involved and they've got some money coming to them. They've got to do certain things in order to earn that money. And then they've got to give up data, okay? So the question is how much data? What's the value of that data? So from a producer standpoint, not only are you selling those things that generate the carbon credits, you're also selling all the data that goes along with that. Because I'm guessing that you're going to give up yield data, you're going to give up fertilizer data, you're going to give up chemical use data. You're going to give up everything but the price that you sold that product for, darn near, I think, in some of these contracts that I see. So just think about, well, the flow of data, okay? And then somewhere up there, there's going to be somebody who's going to have some method of verifying, okay, and they're going to need to get paid. So sometimes the farmer might pay the verifier, sometimes the project developer might pay it. So there's a whole bunch of different sequences on how these different projects get put together. So we'll take a look at those as we go through this. All right. So again, the carbon credit's got value. The farmer needs to know what to expect. And here's just some of the players out there. In his work, Dr. Plastina tried to put these into some different categories. So you've got the carbon market entities with Indigo and Nori. You've got input suppliers like Nutrien that are out there and Bayer who will put together these programs, and they're going to help bring together the contracts and help the money flow back and forth. So there's a variety of different types of these programs out there that you might think about as you're trying to break them into who you would want to do business with. Okay, so here's one for example. Again, the carbon program, we've set it up in these different formats, and it looks like they're going to do what? A private soil lab. So they're going to test your soil for organic matter at the start and then every few years through it. And so they're going to try to measure the impact that you've actually had on the soil. So you're going to do some practices as a producer, but you've got to achieve certain targets then on those soil tests, all right? So that's their system there that they're looking at. And again, the verifier is just verifying that you're doing the no-till or you're doing the cover crop, whatever is in that specification for that. And so again, you're going to get paid there by the carbon program coordinator, Agoro. All right, so we've gone in and put some details in on their contracts. This is from a document that's a month old, so there's no guarantee that the document's accurate today. Okay, like I say, these are rapidly moving arrangements, and so as we think about that, understand that anything in print might not be up to date. So they're looking for what? A 10-year contract, minimum area of 500 acres. You get paid every year, and you get paid off of these practices that you do, okay? Whether it's no-till, or whether it's reducing fertilizer use, or whether it's some cover crop, all right? Here's another one that looks at what? Again, they've got a private lab, and they're looking at taking annual tests in at least 10% of the fields, okay? Their contract length is just 1 year, so it makes sense to do an annual test, right? Okay, minimum area, they're not concerned. Annual payment, and again, paying based on what do you actually do out there in the field. Okay, taking a look at this one, again, they're going to test the soil at the start, and then every 5 years, you got to implement certain practices. 10-year contract, no minimum on acreage, annual payment. So again, we can kind of get an idea of all of these. But again, you're giving up data to different groups as you go through this. Indigos, we got soil sampling, we got lab testing. If you notice on this one, we're going to handle the money a little bit different. Okay, so it's a 5-year contract, minimum 150 acres per field. Your payment, you only get half the money up front year 1. Okay, 20% year 2. So we're going to hold some money back, and that's in case there's a default on your part. And so, you know, again, Indigo's got some helpers out there. They're going to give you some agronomic advice to help you implement these practices. Okay, so and they're stating that, well, we're not sure how this money's all going to flow, and we're not sure what the price of carbon credits are in the future. We can't predict that very well. But in the end, we think we're going to give at least 75% of the money to the farmers. Okay, so they say we're going to operate ours off of our 25%. Okay, so we'll do the verification, the testing, the monitoring, all of that for less than 25% of the total revenue stream. Okay, Portiva, again, they're saying what? Well, a 5-year, but you know, if things don't work out and you want to get out, there's a way to get out of your contract. Okay, and again, they're saying, hey, we're going to push at least 75% of the revenue through to the farmers. So that's one strategy. Okay, again, testing the soil at the start and every 5 years. Okay, so again, you're going to implement certain practices, and they're going to assume that you're going to get some impact on the soil organic matter that shows up. Okay, here we take a look at Nori. Again, you've got, well, this time I've got 2 green lines coming down. Okay, so we're going to do what? We got a 10-year contract, and then it says something about a 10-year retention period. So to me, that means what? I got a 20-year contract, I get paid the first 10, and I've still got to maintain the contract for the next 10 after that. So if I'm a 62-year-old farmer, I'm agreeing to be in a contract till I'm 82 years old. And certainly part of that time I'll serve as a landlord. Well, not certainly, but potentially you could be a landlord for part of that time. And so think about that. But again, if you don't fulfill your commitment on a 20-year contract, who else is going to fulfill that, and who's going to pay the costs of getting out of it? All right. Looking at a minimum of 1,000 acres. And so you've got a pretty stringent cost verification program. And If you're going to have soil testing, we're going to have what? Farmers are going to pay for some of that. Farmers are going to pay for some of the verification. So, this looks like a pretty strong credit. When we take a look at, how permanent it is. And so, again, will this carbon credit sell for more than a 1-year carbon credit? Those are some things to think about as you look here. All right, on this contract here, again, we've got end users and we've got brokers. So we might be selling that credit directly to an end user. We might be selling that credit to a broker who's going to go out and resell it. And if you think down there about the farmer's pocket, he's got to implement those practices and test only if farm is audited. Well, okay, that's interesting. So again, you see some are going to soil test all the time to maintain a database. Some are only going to test if they're audited. So a little different system here, okay? A 1-year contract, but you can get up to 5 years, up to 10 years. 80% of the credit pays to you. 20% gets held back for the practice implementation, okay? So again, different format here, okay? This one is a 5-year contract, minimum of 250 acres, okay? 60% gets paid out when it's sold, 40% gets paid back when we turn around and actually verify, and their verification is what? Remote sensing, okay? So maybe we can do this by satellite then? So we can get enough detail to see if there's a cover crop out there with remote sensing, or maybe remote sensing means using a drone. I'm not just sure what remote sensing means. And we got an issuance up there. 25% of credits retained 100 years. Okay, 15% of credit retained as fees. So again, we've gone in and looked at these various contracts, tried to break them out and say, okay, are they similar in some ways? And so most of the variance is in the project development when you take a look at these. Here's Bayer's program. Again, a 5-year minimum area of 10 acres per field, a payment of $3 per acre per year for no-till, strip-till. Okay, so this is looks like a practice-based payment scheme. All right, so again, they're going to use some of their current technology, field view, to help process all the paperwork in this. And again, they've got different end users and brokers. They're going to test at the offset in every 5 years. So again, these programs are evolving, as we said, and so these might not be the actual contracts that are out there today even, okay? So when we think about these contracts, we need to think about what practice changes does the contract cover? How is the carbon measured? When you think about even soil testing, how is the soil testing done? What is the soil test measuring for? Is it just organic matter? Are we measuring in the top 6 inches like the plow zone for fertilizer? Or are we going to measure a meter deep to get a real handle on what's happening to the organic matter in the total profile? So how are these payments and the costs shared? So some of the payments were based on the practice. Some of the payments are based on the value of what the certificates were sold for. Some of these involve the producer paying for the soil testing. Some of this involves the producer paying for the verification process. And another issue is stacking of payments. Can I sell this credit, or can I sell this practice to more than one place at the same time? Okay. So if I put 100 acres into CRP program, okay, Is there a chance for me to get a CRP payment from the government and then sell a carbon credit to somebody else? I kind of like the idea of double dipping. That's always been useful in the past. And then as we looked through those, we saw there was a lot of difference in the contract length, the terms, and the exit clauses. So when you start thinking about a one-year deal, that might fit in fairly well with a leasing arrangement. If you think about a 5-year deal, does that mean that we're going to go to 5-year lease terms and get longer leases than what we've traditionally had? Maybe we can do that with flex leases. So there might be an opportunity to do that as well. Then are we thinking about 20-year terms? If it's a 10-year pay and I got 10 years on the back end that I don't get paid for, but I've still got to stay in compliance. That does a lot for this permanency issue of, are these permanent credits? If they're going to be around for 20 years, well, that's a start towards permanent, but I don't really think 20 years is all that permanent, quite frankly. And then what's it cost me to get out of this contract if I get into it a couple of years and don't want to play anymore? What happens if, what happens if I die and my kids inherit it and they want to sell the farm? Then how does it work? Okay. And then, so this management data and verification. Okay. So you're required to plant cover crops, and it's terribly dry, and the cover crops don't grow. Well, does the fact that you seeded it by the required date, does that qualify as cover crops, even though nothing grew? So those are some things to think about. And, how much data are you giving up? So if you're giving up your yield data and your fertilizer data and your chemical program, if you're giving up all of that data, would somebody else pay you something for that data as well? Okay, and I think the answer is we're going to see, yeah, there's some places in Minnesota now where we're seeing farmers getting paid for that data. Okay, so you're not just selling the carbon credits, you're also providing them with a lot of data. Okay, and how does this data all get uploaded? Is there support from this company to help you do that? They can provide you with the database. How much time is it going to take for you to do that? What format does that all have to be? And then as far as if you've got to change a tillage system or a fertilizer system, are they going to help you implement that? Are they going to help you with those changes? Is there going to be a way for us to have a insurance program? I think that's one of the things the USDA has been looking at, is should we make a nitrogen fertilizer credit on our traditional crop insurance. If I put on less nitrogen and I end up with a yield loss because of less nitrogen, should that be a covered item under my crop insurance? So maybe there's some things that we can do here and the USDA can do to help us get more aggressive in focusing on these opportunities here in the carbon market. Okay. When you take a look at these carbon credits, and the reason that we need to be involved in agriculture is there's probably 3 or 4 different scenarios here. High demand for high value ag carbon credits. It's where our next source of revenue is going to be, or there could be a high demand for low value ag carbon credits. We're going to sell off the low hanging fruit, so to speak. Maybe there's a low demand for high value carbon credits, and it's something that the government should help foot the bill for. So by extending carbon credits towards agriculture, they could do that. Or is it going to be a low demand for low value carbon credits, and it's really not got much of an opportunity out there for us? So again, if you think about these different quadrants that we could end up in, certainly the next cash crop, here in Iowa, ethanol had a huge impact on us, about 5 billion bushels of use and a total of 15 billion bushels of production. So is carbon credits going to be our next cash crop? If it is, we're going to have to do some things to make that program work. We're going to have to compete against other industries such as forestry that's certainly out in front right now. This market has to be liquid. and it's got to have volume in it, okay? So there's some things that have to happen there. If we think about it being a kind of a low-hanging fruit, we just need a simple verification program. We're not going to generate a lot of revenue that way. We're probably not going to be very competitive against forestry either. And so, so you know that forestry right now is selling off carbon credits just by not harvesting timber. That's one of the ways that they can do it. So low demand for high value ag carbon credits. If we're really successful in getting this carbon back into the soil, I think it's a good use of taxpayers' money. Okay, so will they help support this? Will they see that it's a way to do it? And again, this participation in the carbon programs would have to be subsidized if that's the case. So again, there's a place for government in this whole program as well. And then if there's not much demand and there's not much as far as quality of carbon credits, we're not going to see the industry chase after them. There's other choices out there, and it'll be a market that we've lost. So hopefully that's not the case. Okay, if we take a look at where we're at today, and again, the growth in demand for carbon offsets. Once China decided to get on board, it was huge. Okay, so if you've spent any time in China or India, you've seen some of the pollution, and you go back from, well, do they have room to improve? Well, certainly those two countries have a vast amount of room for improvement, and so again, I think you'll see them come up to speed because it's going to be very lucrative for them to do that. So in the current phase, we've got a lot more credits out there than what there's demand, but hopefully, we see the demand increase, and agriculture is just not much of a player currently. Okay, so a lot to think about, and this is a lot of work that Dr. Plastina and his team have put together. Before you sign any contracts, make sure you understand the benefits and the restrictions and what the legal requirements are. You can go and download from the Ag Decision Maker these two publications. The one is How to Grow and Sell Carbon Credits in the U.S., and the other one is about data and payment flow. So A1-76 and A1-77. Those are both on the Ag Decision Maker website. If you just Google Ag Decision Maker, it'll pop right up. Okay. So again, those are changing documents. They're always look to see if they've been updated or revised. Okay. I found it interesting that you can make methane out of CO2. Renewable hydrogen offers a new path towards cheaper carbon capture. So we've got a lot of research going in. This is some work by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which government agency. They're saying that they can take and capture CO2 and convert it into methane now. I'm sure it's not a cheap process, but if energy prices continue to crawl up, maybe pretty soon it's pretty darn competitive. So again, I think we'll see other opportunities here as we move down the road and think about other uses for CO2. Some of it's used for dry ice today, but if we can make methane out of it, certainly that would be something that would be really usable and in a demand product. Okay, so we've had a lot of attention about two pipeline projects going across Iowa. The idea is that we're going to go out and gather the CO2 off the ethanol plants, and then we're going to take and sequester that into bedrock, either in North Dakota or in Illinois, and that should be a relatively permanent situation. Some situations you can maybe even in North Dakota use it to help in the extraction of crude oil by pumping it into the ground. But nonetheless, there's two projects out there. Summit Carbon Solutions is one. Their map here shows connecting up some of the ethanol plants and then heading to the northwest, going to North Dakota. about 700 miles of pipeline across Iowa. And they've gone through their process with the Iowa Utilities Board. And we've got Navigator also looking at putting together a pipeline that would sequester carbon. Both of these are relatively fast track. They're talking about completion dates in the 2025 or even 2024 for parts of these pipelines so they could be up and running. Their pipeline goes from the northwest down to Illinois. There's actually a project out in Illinois, I believe ADM is already using it in sequestering carbon. But these would have huge impacts. I mean, you're talking about a carbon footprint 3 times the size of the Des Moines metro area. So the goal is to make the ethanol plants have greener ethanol and make them carbon neutral. For example, in the past, we've had California had stringent standards, so they were buying ethanol out of Brazil that was made from sugarcane, and then when the boat went back, it took corn-based ethanol from Iowa back to Brazil. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, so hopefully we get more efficiencies here. There's been certainly anytime there's a pipeline, there's a significant amount of controversy associated with these pipelines. They're regulated by the Iowa Utility Board. If you go to our Center for Ag Law and Taxation website, our CULT website, they've got some blog posts on there, putting up some articles covering everything from the requirements that they have with the Iowa Utility Board, what materials that they've used in their presentations, a lot of questions about surveyors and what the rights and how surveying can be done here. So there's some information on that. Also some discussion about whether or not the Iowa Utility Board will grant them eminent domain so that they have the right to use the county compensation boards. So the Center for Ag Law and Taxation also has some information about the use of the eminent domain and the need for the Iowa Utility Boards to say that this does promote the public convenience and necessity. And if they do that, then they will get eminent domain, and then the county compensation boards will be involved in that process. So again, it's not probably going to go as quickly as some people had hoped, and maybe too quick for others. But nonetheless, they're out with easements. There is a 7-day right to change your mind clause in that document, so you can pay attention to that as you read that. So there's other questions out there about long-term impact on soils. There's been a paper done on that as well. And there's also some questions about the taxation of the compensation that you'll get. We've done some work on that as well. So don't want to mention all the things, but if you go to the CULT website, they're continually adding information about the pipelines on that media. Okay, so that kind of wraps up where I wanted to go today. If you've got other questions, you can get back to me, and I'll be glad to try to answer them or find somebody who can. Again, glad to be a part of the program, and look forward to seeing the producers face to face in the near future. Thank you. Kelvin Leibold, ISU Extension Farm Management Field Specialist, North Central Iowa.